Here we go. Once again, I'm Tony Bridges, Assistant Director with Source. We're the Community Engagement and Service Learning Center, and we're happy that you joined us today for our Myths and Tips panel. Today, we're going to talk about the myths and tips of working in communities in Baltimore City. Again, this is Baltimore Week, and we've got a series of activities that will happen throughout the entirety of Baltimore Week, starting with our donation drive. So each month, or actually each Baltimore week, we try to start the week off with a donation drive. This year, we're doing a canned food drive in support of some of our community organizations that may distribute canned food to those in need. And so if you're in the School of Public Health, you can look for those bins in front of the floor E1002 on the first floor, or in front of the student lounge. If you're in the School of Nursing, that bin would be in the lobby. And in the School of Medicine, it's in the Thomas College Common Room in AMAB or the AMAB lobby. So if you can, please donate for our food, canned food donation drive. Tomorrow, if you have not, please go to the website for Source's website and look up the activities that are happening this week. Like I said, we've got a series of things and events happening this week. Tomorrow is our Racial Justice Concert Series, and that's going to be at noon tomorrow. In addition, on Wednesday, we're doing our virtual East Baltimore bus tour, and that's normally with Glenn Ross, who's our community consultant, where you'll learn everything about some of the assets that we have in the community. You'll do a complete 2-hour tour in a little under an hour, actually 35 minutes, and afterwards we'll debrief with Glenn Ross, who's our community consultant. And then on Thursday, we've got another partner panel. That partner panel is all about how we engage Baltimore youth. And so we've got 4 really good partners from the Baltimore community that we're going to work with, that you'll hear from, and they'll actually talk to you about the things that they need from you as a volunteer, if you're interested in that. And so I don't want to hold our panelists up, however, but I also know that we have a number of staff members here from Source who are also on, such as Mindy Levin, our executive director, Vanessa Pinkney, who's our administrative coordinator, Izat, who does our social media, and Tyler, who is the associate director, who some of you have met or at some point, or you'll all meet us all at some point. But we also have some really good panelists for today's session. So today is all about myths and tips, talking about what's happening in communities, dispelling some of the myths that you might have heard about Baltimore's communities, and also giving you tips about how to work in Baltimore's communities. And so we've got 4 really great panelists today. And what I'm going to do is ask those panelists to introduce themselves. And I'm going to ask them to start by saying their name, organization, or role that you've had in working with a Baltimore community organization, and the capacity of the work that you've done in the community. And after that, I'll ask a series of questions. If you have any questions at all for any of our panelists, please put those questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring those questions, and it doesn't matter at what point you think about that question, make sure you add it to the chat so that we can have a robust conversation with our panelists about working in Baltimore's communities. And so with that, I'm gonna ask that they introduce themselves in this order. We've got one of our professors, Shannon Frattaroli, who's on, Katie Nelson, who has worked in some of Baltimore's communities and can give you a perspective as a student. We also have Grace Wren from Intersection of Change, and Aneeka Ratnayake from Endside Out, and she's gonna say her name correctly, even though we just talked about that. And so in that order, I'll ask them to introduce themselves by giving their name, organization, role at the organization, or role that you had in the community, and the capacity of work that you're doing in the community.
Great. Well, thanks, Tony. I think I was first on the list. My name is Shannon Frattaroli, and as Tony said, I'm a faculty member at the School of Public Health. Perhaps more importantly, I've been involved with Source for many, many years now. I was first a community fellow or a faculty fellow, working with members of the community who were community fellows at the time. I've taught for many years a service learning course, and I was recently involved just this past summer with the Sources Service Learning Academy, which works to bring service learning to faculty and community members who are interested in partnership all across the country. I live in Baltimore City, and I have for many years, which is also, I think, quite relevant to this discussion. And I'm always looking for opportunities to dispel the myths of our wonderful city and the many opportunities and activities that are happening in Baltimore. So thanks for having me.
I think I'm up next. My name is Katie Nelson, and I am a third-year PhD candidate in the School of Nursing and also a nurse with the Johns Hopkins Health System. I've also worn several hats that are relevant to this panel discussion. I served as I was a source service scholar over the last academic year, working closely with Roberta's House. I also serve as a student representative on the Source Governing Board, and I routinely volunteer in the community with several different community-based organizations. I'm a transplant to Baltimore from Minnesota, but very excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace. Like Tony mentioned, I work at Intersection of Change, which is a community-based nonprofit in West Baltimore. So I actually have 3 technically positions here, but I think that in general, working at a nonprofit, each person, their title is just very for formality reasons, like everybody kind of does some of everything, but I am the assistant to the executive director, so kind of a mini him in handling our 3 different programs. So it's kind of confusing, but Intersection of Change is the umbrella nonprofit, and then we have 3 smaller nonprofits, Martha's Place, which provides housing for women recovering from addiction, Strength to Love 2, which is an urban farm that provides resources and employment for formerly incarcerated citizens returning back to the community, and Jubilee Arts, which is our community arts program offering variety of visual and dance classes for community members at very low cost or for free. So that was a mouthful, but I'm also the volunteer coordinator for all 3 programs. So if anyone is interested, just shoot me an email. We're always looking for volunteers. And I was really excited when Tony reached out to me because I graduated from Hopkins undergrad a couple years ago. So I do have very personal experience with kind of this topic of dispelling myths and tips and getting involved in the community. So I'm excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aneeka. I am currently an advisor for Endside Out. We're a nonprofit that focuses on nutritional and movement-related interventions, primarily at the community level amongst school-age children. It seems like my co-panelists also moved to Baltimore, originally from Canada, which I think is relevant in this discussion. And I too, like Grace, first came to Baltimore to do my undergrad at Hopkins, and then ended up staying and doing my master's as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing all your questions and getting to have this discussion with all of you.
Great. I want to thank you all again for agreeing to be panelists for today's discussion. So let's start the discussion. For me, I am an unapologetic Baltimorean. I've been born, raised, lived, worked, played throughout Baltimore. And I know for a number of students that come here from all across the world, there are certain myths that they've heard or seen from things such as The Wire or movies or, just the media about Baltimore. What are some of those myths that you've heard that you would like to start off by debunking from the very beginning about what's happening in Baltimore's communities? And this is for any panelist.
I'll jump in and go first. I think for me, the first thing that a lot of people, when they found out that I was moving to Baltimore, they said, oh, you can't move there because it's a really violent place because of things like The Wire and the way that Baltimore is portrayed in the media. And while, yes, there is violence, we can't pretend like that is not an issue, but I think it's important to recognize where violence stems from and how that's not something that's particularly unique to Baltimore. It's, we see violence across many big cities, many urban areas, but we have to think about, the social determinants of health and what really is causing the root cause of that violence. And so I think, we have to focus on working to achieve things like access to health, education, healthy foods, livable wages for people in the community, and also reckon with things like colonization, systemic racism, discrimination, and things like that also contribute to that violence. But when you get past all that and you really get to know a place, you realize that is extremely not true. And despite, the hardships and the challenges that many people do face, the people are extremely warm, very welcoming, and are really resilient and want to, do better for the people in their community and make those changes in order to overcome some of those hurdles.
Thanks, Katie. Would anybody else like to answer that as well?
I think one of the myths that at least I thought of when I was first moving to Baltimore, and perhaps this is also like a question of just a trans-border move in general, but there was a certain like homogeneous way in which people spoke about the city, as though like you could quantify everything to a mean and say like, well, this is how it is everywhere. And there was a complete lack of nuance, I think, in the discourse. And that comes like in what Katie said about things like structural barriers that manifest at like an individual or community level. But I think that also came about sort of how, at least initially, people talked about solving some of those problems too, as if we could kind of like put one blanket solution out there and it would work. And so that was one thing that I really started to unpack as a student, because I had incredible mentors and got to work with folks who are all community members directly. And then have, tried to continue to unpack in the work that I'm doing now, in terms of just recognizing that there's a whole complex history behind, all these different manifestations within the city, which we talk about kind of as these like isolated events instead of sometimes looking at that history. And so just beginning to acknowledge like how those different factors come together to create a very nuanced and complex environment, I think is incredibly important.
You made some really good points. And so thank you for that. You started to talk about the history of the city. Well, let's talk about the history that Hopkins also has with the East Baltimore community, which is really a storied history that, a lot of people are, especially if you live in the community, are well aware of. But keeping that history in mind, how do you think you approach partnership activities in order to stay down that positive path with the community because of that storied history that East Baltimore and Hopkins have had in the past? Of course, we want to make sure that we keep a really good and a positive path moving forward. So for any of the panelists, how do you approach the community and working together?
Well, I think one, not to be too obvious, but one is like partnering with different Hopkins departments and organizations like SOURCE or the Center for Social Concern for the undergrad campus. So I actually started working at Intersection of Change through the Community Impacts Internship Program, which is from, again, the Homewood campus, their Center for Social Concern, which is like the same thing as SOURCE pretty much. So I wouldn't have probably discovered Intersection of Change or gone involved with them had it not been for that partnership. So one thing that I'm pretty adamant about, especially in my volunteer coordinator position, is staying connected with Center for Social Concern and staying connected with SOURCE, because I tend to find that the students who gravitate towards these departments or offices are usually the kinds of students who want to create some sort of genuine or authentic connection with the Baltimore community. So, working with those kinds of students can create more meaningful connections and kind of reroute Hopkins students and the idea of Hopkins in general towards more community engagement, and kind of show not just the community, but also Hopkins students that it's not like this terrifying thing or impossible thing to get involved in these communities, that it's very doable, and that a lot of great work can come out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that. I completely agree, Grace, and I would just say that, being open and being, hearing from people who have lived here and who do live here about what their vision is, what their view, what their lives are like, what their communities are like, is really important. So listening in a genuine way is important, and really creating space for partnership that's meaningful. So figuring out how you can truly work together, as opposed to kind of imposing the Hopkins agenda on the community, is important as well. And I think once you truly get out and start listening, engaging in real conversation, and hearing about all the wonderful visions and goings on that are happening throughout this city, it's really easy to start to get back to our first question, to start to just melt those myths away, and to really create a true picture of what Baltimore City is really like, that's based on the voices and experiences and the visions of the people who live here and have lived here for many years, and sometimes for many generations.
Yep, thank you for that. You both mentioned some key words that just wanted to highlight, like authentic relationships or genuine working together. For us, especially through Source, we like to always talk to our student, staff, and faculty about working with communities. It's not about, as Shannon, as you said, the Hopkins agenda, it's the community's agenda. They've lived here. They know what they need. It's not about us telling them what they need. It's about us working to help them with the needs that they share with us. And so I think through Source, we try to do that as much as possible. But the question I have for our panelists is, what health challenges have you noticed while working in communities, and how has Hopkins and the community worked together to meet those challenges?
I think for me, being a nurse, the last 18 months, I've been consumed with COVID-19 on the brain, as I'm sure many other people on this call have. But I guess sort of the health challenge related to that I've seen across the community is, how these issues and the longstanding, tension between Hopkins and the community, that, discrimination and things like that have affected the historical mistrust that many people in this community have against healthcare providers and the system at large. And I also have seen how that has impacted people's access to getting, that up-to-date evidence-based information on these public health guidelines and measures that we know are so important for combating this pandemic. And there's obviously a trickle-down effect in terms of misinformation then that gets spread about COVID-19 and things like that. But what I've been so impressed about, I've been involved for years with Medicine for the Greater Good, which is an initiative out of the School of Medicine and Bayview that really recognizes medicine and healthcare as a public trust. And so there's been many initiatives going out into the community, working with churches and congregations and hosting health fairs, any place you can imagine, taking mobile vans into communities where they may not have access to the vaccine, all of these things really to bring that information and, the stuff that we know people need the science, but bringing it to their level. So not showing up in the scary white coats and stethoscopes, but showing up dressed as a real human, genuinely coming to help show our support. And I just want to highlight, Source has been really involved as well as a partner on the JHU Heat Corps, the Health Education and Training Corps, which has been a huge partnership and done such a great job of getting information to kids and students in the schools to help, part of this is just encouraging people to be part of the solution as well. I think that's a huge part of community engagement and just empowering them so that they have the information to then take it back to their own communities. And it's been such a privilege for me to be a clinical moderator on some of these sessions and hear the really thoughtful questions that people genuinely have, and they want to know the information. It's just a matter of making sure that everybody has access to it.
Thanks, Katie. Does anybody else want to take a shot at that one?
So I can certainly jump in and, maybe with a complementary perspective to Katie's clinical perspective, which is getting back to actually something that I think Katie said early on, which was pointing to the structural issues that sort of are really underlying a lot of the health challenges that we face here in Baltimore City. And when I think about structural issues that need attention, it's really attention to the policy process. And actually, Tony, I think you have a lot to contribute here. But when we think about why the structures continue to be the way they are in cities like Baltimore and all across the country, the greatest one of the greatest potential to change those structures lies with policy. And so when I sort of look around, one of the things that I enjoy working with community organizations around is those that are focused on, okay, how can we change sort of the policies that are governing how resources are distributed in our city, that are sort of speaking to how educational systems are structured in our city. So when I look at sort of the potential and the things that are need to be done in Baltimore City and all my sort of favorite activities that are happening and that I'm incredibly inspired by, it's all the great people like Delegate Bridges and the community organizations that are seeking to open up the policy process so that we can have communities and policymakers engaging more and coming up with policy solutions that are really going to result in a better city for everyone.
Yes, thank you for saying that. There are, a number of organizations that we work with also have a sort of advocacy arm associated with them. And so it's not uncommon for me to see some of our community-based organizations in Annapolis advocating for change for things around public health or the environment or even social justice issues. Those things are really key to us. When I say us, for those of you who don't know, I'm also a state delegate. I represent part of Baltimore City for 90 days in Annapolis for our general session, for our session work. So, it's not uncommon for many of our community-based organizations to also be in Annapolis, which is our state capital, advocating for change around different policies. And so, I think that policy work is definitely key to creating change throughout the city. So there was another question that I saw in the chat, and Anne asked that question. Anne wants to know, can you all talk about how the pandemic has impacted your work with the community? I think, Katie, you had started talking about the pandemic and work around there, but if anybody wants to answer how your work has changed as a result of the pandemic.
Well, I would say that, just even the word community itself, has that in itself has been impacted just because the idea of community is like being able to congregate and being able to, meet other people and talk to other people in the community. And, obviously that is not really something we could do for a long time. And even now, we're still kind of being more cautious of it. So I would say that in itself has been difficult, especially at Intersection of Change, which is a community-based nonprofit. A lot of our work involves interacting with the people who live in our area, and having them interact with each other. I can't really necessarily say that we have like the perfect solution, because we don't really, especially because, a lot of the people we serve don't necessarily have like amazing access to technology. The Wi-Fi in this area has just historically been horrendous, like just horrible. But yeah, I think that's been the main challenge. People can't really necessarily just get on Zoom and then we can keep meeting as usual. One thing we've done for our Martha's Place program, which is, again, just the residential recovery program for women recovering from substance use, we were able to apply to a lot of grants to get money to buy 15 laptops for everybody to use. But then again, there's the issue of like, okay, a lot of our women who live here are much older, so we have to like teach them how to use it, teach them, how to even just make a Zoom account or get onto a Zoom meeting. So as you can see, the issues kind of compound each other. And again, one thing I've been saying this whole time is the pandemic has really highlighted a lot of just key systemic issues that we face in this country. So really, I don't even think it's necessarily that the pandemic has caused these issues, but it's just these issues have been here the whole time. And now we're really just starting to see, we're kind of being forced to address them in many ways that we haven't. So yeah, that's just kind of like a little bit of it, but yeah, just even getting people together.
I think I would echo that as well. Like a lot of our interventions are based on the idea that if you create change at a community level, that's in part due to like network diffusion, right? And like on sort of very straightforward terms, like we work with kids, and if we sort of get kids thinking like, if I get out and I move my body in a way that feels good, or like I, pick a serving of veggies, like that all makes me feel great, and they go and tell their friends, like that becomes sort of a social norm, right? And that's kind of a lot of how like the philosophies of behavior change and things like that we use to drive our work. And that's incredibly hard when you don't have kids sitting together in a cafeteria, or you don't have kids like out at recess, like hanging out and playing and things like that. And then to compound that, it's not just that we don't have access to those networks, like to be able to kind of tap in and allow, interventions or innovations to diffuse across that network, but also then kids don't have that outlet, around like mental health to, really excel in school, things like that. Like we know that this pandemic has just had devastating impacts on K-12 education, on, absenteeism, all these like factors that so like inherently impact the educational experience. So I think for us, it's really been a challenge, not only because of our reliance on just in-person and social connectivity to just implement our interventions, but also because now we're finding that we have to kind of be able to also address and meet students' needs where they are. And we're certainly challenged in that dimension. And particularly, I think, also not, entirely being able to plan for the future in terms of like when we'd go back to in person, or when it would be safe to do so, what K-12 education is going to look like over the next year, the next 2 years, things like that. I think that's been particularly challenging as well.
Yeah, thanks. You bring up so many good points. And as you all were talking, I was just thinking about, the work of policymakers around all of these activities. Especially thinking about the digital divide and the fact that, a lot of even our students, most of their parents will have to go to work while they're home being on a computer. And for our younger generation, especially as they're home with grandparents, where there's the grandparents who, have trouble logging on and understanding, everything dealing with computers and the internet. But you also have students, younger kids who are also learning for the first time how to log on and do things. And so that digital divide was even, greater in terms of what we learned in Annapolis, just from students trying to navigate student work during the school year. So more to be done around that, definitely. But the pandemic has definitely brought many things to light about how we need to do things moving forward. Rasika had a question in the chat. What are some of the things that the panelists think international students who are new to the U.S. and Baltimore should know before working in the local community for the first time? And is there a difference between the international students knowing things versus, students from other parts of the state, United States?
I can certainly jump in on the international front. I would strongly encourage you to firstly read, there's tons and tons of books about Baltimore, specifically about kind of some of the laws and structures in the US that have affected just how society operates. And I would really strongly encourage you to pick up some of those. Some of my favorites around Baltimore, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's kind of a must, I feel like, for Baltimore. I also found Not in My Neighborhood is a good one for social justice issues around place. But then Color of Change, New Jim Crow, those kinds of books are really informative about how certain policies have created this effect that we see play out in kind of a phenomena type context, as opposed to understanding it as a system of policies and social structures that have created those phenomena, if that makes sense. And then also, I would strongly encourage you to be really open to learning from those around you. So, the more time you spend in a place, I think the better sense of that place you'll get. So just encouraging you to go out in Baltimore and explore different areas, work with community organizations in a way that meets their needs, things like that. But then simultaneously, at least for me, something that was important was always recognizing I'm never going to maybe fully understand what it's like. I not having grown up, not having lived in Baltimore my whole life, I need to defer to folks who have that lived experience rather than assuming that my lived experience is the same. But there are things that I can learn and not burden others on having to teach me, but then defer to them about lived experience, if that makes sense. I think that was the balance that I found was important, especially coming from a different country. It could be a little bit of a change of pace in general. So just doing the best to kind of learn and get used to your environment.
Yeah, thanks. And I would also add that there's a lot in the chat about the wonderful resources that Source has compiled along the lines of what Aneeka was suggesting that people read up on. I would say there's also, no need to kind of set up relationships on your own, right? We have Source at the school, which is a wonderful organization that has, for decades now, I think it's decades, really done the work of building those good relationships, establishing trust, so that people who are new to Baltimore, who are coming to the school for maybe a year or 2 years, can, sort of follow in with those relationships that have been established and tested and worked out, and really pave the way for, students to come in and benefit from. So I would encourage you to recognize that you're not on your own in this at all, that there's a great infrastructure to support, your interest and engagement in this area.
Oh, I do want to add something really fast, if that's okay, Tony. Okay. Also, I really appreciate everybody sharing the Source resources, but one thing that I found really helpful in terms, kind of going back to what Aneeka was saying about getting involved in the community and actually going to events, is kind of looking outside of Hopkins maybe for information, because in terms of maybe more social events or gatherings, the school is not necessarily going to be able to send out information about all of those. So depending on what you're interested in, for example, like I'm an artist, so I've been really interested in keeping up with like the Baltimore art scene. So signing up for newsletters from like the Baltimore Office of Promotion of the Arts, which kind of handles, all the arts things in Baltimore, and their newsletters always have tons of events to go to. And from those events, like you can meet more people, possibly like network if you're already working at a community organization that might be related. So I think doing research on things like the city has in place, even going on like the city government website. I don't know how great that'll be in terms of like finding fun stuff, but a good place to start. And just looking at things that are already in place and are putting out a lot of information.
Yep. Thanks for mentioning that, Grace. There are some other activities, and I think Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts is really also a good place to look. They do have a number of events and activities that they send out in a newsletter and even on their website. So you can find things about like the farmers markets and other places that you can also go throughout the city. Speaking of working in some of these communities, though, and I know Katie has done a lot of work with some of our Baltimore communities, but can I just ask you to highlight the work that you did with the Source Service Scholars? For those of you who don't know, with the Source Service Scholars program, we have established that program to at least allow our students to work with a nonprofit organization over the course of an academic year to be sort of a project manager for that organization. There are a number of nonprofits, especially in Baltimore City, who really just do not have the staffing to get many of the things done that they need to do. And so they rely on volunteers. And so what we've tried to do is at least establish a program where we have students act as project managers to help get those projects that they have talked about and have thought about for a long time, but just don't have the staffing resources to actually move that project to completion. And Katie, I know, had worked as a Source Service Scholar. So I just wanted her to kind of highlight some of the work that she did.
Yeah, sure. So as I said in my introduction, I was a Source Service Scholar with Roberta's House last year. And the program actually came at a perfect time, as that was when a lot of community-based organizations were having to switch all their programming online because of the pandemic. And so there was definitely a need for this group of project managers to sort of come in and help figure out and troubleshoot, how do we move all this stuff virtual? In my role, we were able, it was, it took some time to sort of figure out what are the goals of the organization, what is my expertise, what skills do I bring where I can sort of help, maybe fill in some of those gaps that they had. And so we ultimately ended up forming a new support group, because Roberta's House is just for a little bit of context, they are a grief support organization. They provide anything from support after a homicide to support when someone dies from cancer to maternal, fetal support after the death of a child, all along the spectrum. And so they had recognized that COVID-19 had presented a new type of grief that they hadn't really filled in terms of the support groups that they already had going. And so we conducted a needs assessment, and we sent it to the staff, the volunteers, and then the greater Roberta's House community. And everybody sort of identified that people who are affected by COVID-19, whether, it's just they're a frontline worker and they feel isolated, still having to go to work while everyone else was working from home at the time, or if someone lost a loved one to COVID-19, it was just a different type of grief, and there wasn't quite a structure in place yet that was addressing those unique needs. And so I worked with my preceptors at Roberta's House to develop a curriculum for that support group. And then as part of the Source Service Scholars program, you are responsible for recruiting at least 4 volunteers from the tri-school East Baltimore campus to contribute to your project. And that's to help support the sustainability of the project, because the goal is that once you leave, the project that you were working on for the academic year can sustain itself. And so I recruited people to be support group facilitators. And so we met on a bi-monthly basis for 4 or 5 months with people from the community who just needed a safe space to come in, sort of debrief about what they were going through. And they've since taken that and run with it, and now are using that curriculum in sort of a different format, but the project is still ongoing. And some of the volunteers that I recruited are still on board and volunteering with Roberta's House. So it was a great experience overall.
Great. I'm glad that you had a really good experience with Roberta's House and with the program. I know Victoria asked the question, how are students assessed for qualification to be trained to be a project manager for a nonprofit? So there's a whole application process that happens for the Source Service Scholars Program. And in that application process, we also set you up with an interview with the organization to help them and you understand what the organization's needs really are. Once you get through that process, we have what are called academy sessions. And they're usually a couple of times throughout the first quarter of the year, where we really work with you to talk about what project management means, talk about cultural humility, how to work in Baltimore's communities. There are a number of things that we go over through our academy sessions, and you'll learn more about being a project manager through those academy sessions. Looks like some folks are having to jump off. Okay, so that was another question. Before anybody else jumps off, I do want to allow Grace and Aneeka to talk about some of the volunteer opportunities that you currently have through your organizations. So if you want any students to know how they can volunteer and be a part of your organization, I want to give you some time to talk about that now.
I guess I can start. So my short answer is literally everything, but yeah, I think one thing that I do really try when interacting with volunteers is to kind of see what their strengths are and kind of apply that, because obviously we want it to be like an enjoyable experience for everyone, but also, you know, if somebody is already good at something and we can use that something, then that's like a win-win situation. But I will say that some of our regular volunteer opportunities at our Strength to Love 2 urban farm, we have volunteers come and just help out with general farm tasks. And it's been nice, especially during the pandemic, because, you know, it's outdoors and our farm is 1.5 acres. So, you know, you can stay pretty spaced out from everyone. And that's kind of just general things like harvesting produce, washing and packaging stuff, turning compost, clearing areas, things like that. But everyone who does it has said that they have really enjoyed it and they've gotten like a chance to learn more about urban agriculture and sustainability. So that has been very popular for volunteers. Other things are with our Jubilee Arts program, we are always looking for kind of, we call them like Zoom hosts. So for the classes, which are all over Zoom now, just kind of logging in and making sure that everybody feels welcome, like when all the kids are logging on, and if anybody's having technical issues, which always happens, just kind of guiding them through that, and being there to help the teaching artist throughout the class whenever anything comes up, or if you need to have like breakout rooms, kind of managing that is really helpful. But yeah, like I said, if you have any particular strength and you don't really know what you want to do with volunteering, like we can work with that. That's totally fine. So yes. For Tiffany, our name is Strength to Love 2. Yes. And my email, I can put it in the chat as well, but my email is just volunteercoordinator@intersectionofchange.org, but it's kind of long, so I'll put it in there for anyone who's interested.
So I think I would echo a lot of what Grace said. Like, we also have a very like strengths based approach to things. So if you have time and you want to volunteer with us, we'd love to have you. And I would not be the best person, but I can definitely just put my email in there and then connect you depending on to whom, because we have sort of program managers in our different areas. If you're more interested in like programming or public health stuff and development, things like that. But yeah, we're also a small nonprofit, so we're certainly always happy to have very qualified people who want to give their time. And for us, it's much more of generally like a more behind the scenes kind of operation. Like, we put together a lot of programs for different age groups in schools. We work on programs that would supplement those amongst community members, parents, groups like that. But we certainly love to sort of engage with students. We are working with a number of students through the SOURCE program, and we're just really grateful for their support as well. So certainly, I'll just put this is just my personal email, but I'd be happy to sort of connect you through the organization.
Thanks. And we've also, if you look at the chat, we've also provided the link on our source page. We have all of our community partners on the page, as well as their contact information and the volunteer opportunities that they have listed. So if you go to those links, you'll be able to find the contact information as well as some of the opportunities that our community-based organizations have for you. In the time left, if there are any other questions, please make sure you put those in the chat. But I will ask, and thank you once again to our panelists. This has been a really, really good discussion. Are there any final sort of ideas or interesting tips that you have for the ways that our students, staff, and faculty can get involved in the community that you'd like to share?
I'll just say from a student's perspective, I know it can be overwhelming coming into a new program, or whether you're in an existing program. It's easy to get bogged down with schoolwork and other sort of school-related demands, but I would just encourage everyone to take a step back and make sure that you're also taking the time to really be part of the community that you're a part of here in Baltimore. And also, as part of that, I think, especially people who are, in public health, medicine, nursing, I would hope most people are joining those professions because they want to help and make change. And so as part of that, really getting out into the community is such a good way to sort of reinforce your why and why you're going through what you are. And so make sure that you're taking the time to do those important things that sort of fill you up and keep you going.
I would add to that, from a former student perspective, it also will very much help your academic career. I think one thing that I found was it's easy to it's not easy, but you can do your schoolwork in a nutshell and kind of just think about it from an academic perspective. But as Katie said, in these professions, whether it's medicine, nursing, public health, we're very much social professions, right? We're socially driven, especially on the spectrum of more kind of structural public health stuff, but even in individual practice, right? Because these factors all manifest at that individual level too. So I think having tangible experience is super helpful, because you might, be able to develop, say, an intervention that's very academically sound, but it's maybe not super feasible. And those are the kinds of things that I think when you get hands-on experience, they become a little more evident. And just navigating the challenge of making something feasible, I think, is just something that you have to do. No amount of kind of theoretical coursework is going to entirely prepare you for that. I think just having that combination, and we know Hopkins has excellent training, that's not a question, but just supplementing that with just hands-on experience, at least in my experience, was incredibly helpful in helping me become a practicing public health professional, as opposed to just a purely theoretical one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that one thing that I like to emphasize to people who are new to Baltimore is something about the city that just continues to amaze me. It's one of the things that I just love about Baltimore, which is the really strong association that people have with their neighborhoods. So there are hundreds of neighborhoods in Baltimore City. And I would just, and people in neighborhoods like to talk about their neighborhoods, and they like to know people in their neighborhoods, which, you know, I moved here from Southern California where we, you know, we build walls around our homes. And, you know, it's a good day for reasons I don't quite understand if you can go about your business without running into the people who live in your neighborhood. But it's very different here. And again, it's one of the things that I love about this city. So I encourage you to find out what your, you know, wherever you're living, what's the neighborhood association. And that will really be helpful to you, I think, in understanding whatever organization you work with, because chances are they're going to be talking at some point in the language of neighborhoods. And you know, just being familiar and fluent in what neighborhoods mean in Baltimore will help you understand, you know, how people operate in this great city.
Yeah, just to kind of wrap up, I guess I agree with what everybody else said. But just being open and being a good listener, I think, because obviously it doesn't even just apply to Baltimore, but, you know, going into any new space, going into any new company or organization that you're working with, like, you're obviously not going to know everything or even maybe like half of everything. So just really taking information from, you know, the people who work there, the people who live there, and just being open to talking to people. I think, you know, when I first started working at Intersection of Change, I was like really self-conscious. I was like, I don't want to talk to anybody. Like, they're going to know that I'm like from Hopkins and they're going to hate me immediately, which, okay, maybe that's true. But still, like, I think, you know, people are, I think it was Katie or many, probably a lot of people said this, but people are really friendly here. You know, they're always willing to share their experience, and people love like talking about themselves and their neighborhoods. Like, if you just ask, they will love to like tell you everything. So being open to that and kind of just stepping out of your comfort zone, it will all be okay.
Awesome. Thank you all so very much. This has been really an awesome panel. You all are amazing. Thank you for the work that you do in your communities, the work that you're doing at Hopkins, and just for the city of Baltimore. As I mentioned, I'm a lifelong Baltimorean, a very unapologetic Baltimorean. I love my neighborhood, and I love the neighborhoods in Baltimore City. I mean, for those of you who don't know, there's even a place called Pigtown where they literally run pigs during a festival in Pigtown during the summer. We have some very unique and you know, very energetic neighbors within each one of these communities, and like Shannon said, they are all very different, and you know, the people, you just meet them and you immediately fall in love with the communities in Baltimore City, depending on the communities that you're in and what you're into. And so with that, I just want to thank our panelists once again for an amazing conversation. Thank you for debunking those myths and giving some really good tips about ways to work in our Baltimore's communities. And so with that, I will allow you all to leave now. And please, please, please make sure that you register for any of the events that we have moving forward for the rest of Baltimore week. So thank you for a really good event, for our first event for Baltimore week. All right, have a good day.